Welcome to another episode of the Cottage Chronicles. I'm your host, Neil Colicchio, the founder of New Dawn Tackle Company. On this episode, I'll be featuring some of my scariest and spookiest outdoor stories. I've got tales of a UFO, an encounter with Slenderman, a visit from a forest spirit, and an update on the haunted lure. If you're listening with kids or you're a bit squeamish, don't worry. There won't be any jump scares or any gore. It's really important to me that, like the sport of fishing itself, I keep this show accessible and enjoyable for everyone. To that end, I've been reading a lot of fishing stories lately. I've been listening to an audio version of Sex, Death, and Fly Fishing by John Garrick. I've been reading a hard copy of The Last Wild Road by T. Edward Nickens. I also read a Sand County Almanac by Aldo Leopold, and I'm a huge fan of anything by Jack London. For this show, I'm trying to find the right tone that's descriptive, compelling, and still family-friendly. So I alternate between reading directly from the script and telling the stories the way that I would tell them conversationally. I have a hard time doing this while keeping swears, non-sequiturs, and filler words to a minimum. So if it looks like I'm reading right from the teleprompter, don't worry too much. I'm practicing with each new episode. Speaking of teleprompters, I hope those who are watching this episode on video will appreciate some changes I made this month. I just bought a new webcam and I've got a new backdrop behind me. I am experimenting with a teleprompter to try to keep me on track and keep some of the jump cuts to a bit of a minimum. Another big change is happening this month, but it's not something that I've done. The state of Massachusetts has started their trout stocking schedule again for the fall. I've been out a couple times, but I haven't caught anything yet. I dropped 2 trout the other day, a rainbow and a brown. I've caught a few pickerel, and I've seen a couple of other trout swirl near me. I know the pools where they're holding up. I just haven't had any luck actually landing them yet. So I'm hopeful that within the next week or two, I'll land some. If you like fishing blogs, I did a target species teardown on building the perfect trout tackle box a couple weeks back. It's mainly geared towards shallow stream fishing in the Northeast, but I've got some tips on catching lake trout in there too, despite the fact that I've yet to catch one. Cue imposter syndrome. I've caught brookies, browns, rainbows, and cutthroats, and I stand by anything I've written on the subject. But it's kind of a funny thing selling fishing gear as a fairly average angler. But that's the thing about fishing, right? No matter how seasoned of an angler you are, every trip will surprise you. There's always something unexpected waiting for you on the water. Maybe it's a day when nothing's biting. Or maybe it's the kind of day that makes for a story that you'll tell around the dinner table or around the campfire for years to come. Every cast has the potential to be the start of a great story. It could be the story of a triumphant battle, a journey of self-discovery, or even a horror story. As you might imagine, a hobby that takes you out on the water, often alone and in low light conditions, can lead to some pretty terrifying experiences. And I've got a few that stick with me to this day. Despite my best efforts, I cannot picture the pier in my mind's eye. Its memory, like many from my childhood, is more of a memory of a feeling than a specific place or event. I remember the feeling of live shrimp and small crabs scampering out of my hands and back into the bait bucket. I remember the irritating glow of the pier lights late at night, and I remember the excitement of seeing the shadows cruising just around the pier. Stingrays as big as a rental car hovering just above the sandy ocean bottom. While we tried our luck at least once every April school vacation, none of us, not my brother, my dad, my cousins, nor I, ever had much success. Dad reminisces about the pompano that he caught decades ago, but I remember no such catch since I came into the picture. I can think of just 2 exceptions. One was when my eldest cousin pulled a basketball-looking mass out from the shadows, which turned out to be a fully inflated and agitated pufferfish. The second exception was a catch of my own, which has since been commemorated by a tattoo on my inner arm, which also serves as a memorial to my late friend Eric. When I was younger, most fishing trips that didn't involve ravenous schools of sunfish or insatiable scup seemed to last an eternity. Only my dad could tell you whether or not this trip actually did. For the sake of this story, I'll say it was late in the evening, my fingers were pruny from chasing bait around the bucket, and I was ready to call it a night. If left to my own devices, I'd have grabbed an ice cream and hit the arcade hours ago. In fact, one part of this story that takes zero creative liberties is that I'd rather be at the hotel catching a Noli's than sitting on the pier waiting for a bite. The idea of the pier was great, and I looked forward to spending time with the guys, especially my older cousins. In reality, though, I couldn't last more than an hour or two without getting restless. The cousins weren't around for this trip, so I was just about ready to grab my razor scooter and hit the boardwalk. When the line came tight and I confirmed that I wasn't caught on the bottom, all thoughts of ice cream and arcades left my head. Ice cream and razor scooters could wait. After nearly a decade of sitting on that splintering old pile of planks, my time had finally come. The gods of sand and sea took mercy on me. It was a quick fight. I kept constant pressure on the line, though there was really nothing but dead weight on the other end. As we did with the pufferfish years before, 3 of us looked over the rail in anticipation. Rising up from the shadows, an amorphous blob hung limp at the end of my line. A wet mop would be more identifiable, if slightly less shiny, in the dim pier light. I swung the rod tip over the rail, Dad's hand guiding the line, to reveal what we soon discovered to be a UFO, an unidentified flying octopus. Splat! It landed right on the pier, extending its tendril-like legs out in all directions, slinking and slunking across the planks. We froze, debating whether to cut it loose or send it flying through the rails like Adam Vinatieri. While we deliberated, the octopus graciously unhooked himself and flopped over the edge of the pier with a dull sploosh. The UFO remains the weirdest thing I've ever caught, but certainly not the scariest. In my early 20s, about a year after I graduated from college, my wife Lauren and I rented our first apartment. We were steps from the town recreation field. Soon after moving in, we got our first dog, Penny. We'd take her to the field before and after work to get the zoomies out and to socialize with other local dogs and their owners. Most of the dogs were there to splash in the pond at the far end of the field, just beyond the soccer fields and opposite the parking lot. One of the regulars was a medium-sized lab with an affinity for fishing. We watched one day as she snorkeled around the pond in search of small bluegills and pint-sized bass. Not believing it at first, we confirmed with the other dog owners that she was in fact a fishing dog. A dog who would spend the workday at her owner's side and unwind with a night of fishing after a long day in the office. Years later, I too could be described as a fishing dog. After seeing this dog spend an hour or so plodding around the shallows and snapping just short of fish after fish, we decided to throw some crumbs from the bottom of the kibble bag into the pond. The crumbs, barely small enough to create a ripple, attracted a swarm of sunfish. It looked like a scene from the Amazon, the We Have Piranhas at Home version. Just across town was a Kmart, the most disorganized, poorly stocked department store I've ever had the misfortune of stepping into. While I rarely found snack food or apartment necessities there, they did have a sporting goods section. With $20 in my pocket and panfish on my mind, I splurged for a Zebco slingshot rod and reel combo. It served me well in my early fishing and kayaking adventures, becoming my backup rod for the better part of a decade before eventually meeting its demise in a car door accident. The reel's attached to another rod in my shed. The upper part of that rod met its own demise in a shallow stream in southern New Hampshire. That rod was the very same that met its tragic end when I was microfishing with my friend Mike a few episodes back. Along with my new rod and reel, I bought a selection of Blue Fox Vibrax spinners in silver, gold, and copper. These didn't last as long as the slingshot combo, but they've become staples in my tackle box for every season since. 12 years later, they're still among my most used and most recommended lures for any species. One muggy night in late August, Lauren and I were at the dog park with Penny. I decided to hang around for an extra hour or two to do some fishing. The other dogs had left at this point and the sun was going down. The mosquitoes were gathering in dense black clouds around the perimeter of the park. I walked around the pond, casting from a few different spots, catching and releasing as I went. As the shadows of the red oak grew longer and night crept in, the mosquitoes grew in number. Not expecting them to swarm us as I did, I hadn't packed any bug spray when we left the apartment. Eventually, they got bad enough that I started trying to blow them off my face with sharp breaths to keep both hands free so I could keep fishing. Zzz. Zzz. A few rounds of this cat and mouse game, and then the pattern started to change. Zzz. Zzz. The open water's become my sanctuary in recent years. By day, I'd say the same thing about the forest. But by night, there's an entirely different feeling. One that's made me uneasy, even back to my Cub Scouting days. Something about it just feels like I'm a visitor in the realm of the forest spirits. And I'd hate to find out what would happen if I overstayed my welcome. Stamp. Stamp. I turned to see if my wife and dog had returned to the picnic table over my left shoulder, but they'd already gone to the parking lot. The hairs on my neck stood on end. I whipped around to check over my right shoulder, where I found a white-tailed buck waiting for me, challenging me to a gentleman's duel after my snorts of air had summoned him from across the field. I grabbed my fishing gear white-knuckled and stepped back from the pond, now facing the deer with him front left and the pond immediately to my left. I slowly backed away. I've always been told to make noise and make yourself appear bigger when you need to scare off a black bear, but I had no idea what to do with an amorous deer. Our standoff ended almost as suddenly as it began. Something in the woods got his attention. The deer walked briskly across the field, putting half the distance of a soccer field between us, before stopping and surveying the park one last time. He looked back at me with a final snort, before returning to the domain of fawns and fiddleheads. Lauren and I arrived in Utah on September 16th, 2019, the day after our wedding. We flew into Salt Lake City and stayed there for a night before driving up to Bear Lake the following afternoon. After checking into our rental in Garden City, we doubled back to Logan to stock up on some groceries and fishing supplies. I'd only learned that Bear Lake existed a couple months before when my aunt sent me a list of places in her timeshare network that were within a day's drive of Yellowstone, a destination where we'd wind up the following week. A few hours scouring the internet had convinced me. I was in search of three things that week: solitude, big lake trout, and the Bear Lake Monster. So I wanted to stock up at night and get a head start on my hiking and fishing adventures first thing in the morning. I picked up a collapsible rod, along with some tubes, jig heads, and some frozen cut bait. I don't really remember what I got for groceries, other than some blueberry lemon snack bars and some frozen tamales. With the cooler bag full and fishing supplies acquired, we headed to the local gluten-free deli to get a sandwich. As a side note, when traveling with someone with celiac disease, you'll soon develop unparalleled navigational skills. You'll build a mental map of every local dive that has a gluten-free menu, and come to memorize all of the national chains with gluten-free options in at least 3 surrounding states. Bellies full, bags packed, and car gassed up, we returned to Logan Pass sometime shortly after 9 p.m. The uphill drive was dark and unremarkable, except for the 18-wheeler that started closing distance just before the way station. For those unfamiliar with the area, the pass terminates in a series of switchbacks that starts right around a way station at the crest of the hill. Large trucks and anyone towing a boat must pull off. Others can carry on. It's easy enough to navigate, but the 55-mile-per-hour S-turn in the pitch dark was a real treat. It was the start of the very same S-turn, truck lights shining through the rear windshield of the Nissan Kicks that the rental agent in Salt Lake City had provided as an upgrade and a honeymoon gift, that I started to see a figure approaching in the distance. At first, it looked like a tall man who'd just stepped out of Hot Topic circa 2004. Dark shirt, dark pants, and not an ounce of body fat on him. Something was off about him, but I couldn't tell what. The first clue that something wasn't right was his position relative to the road. He was mostly on the shoulder, but closer to oncoming traffic than any sane human being had any reason to be. Secondly, he was at least as tall as any NBA player, past or present. Third, and most disturbing, was that he didn't budge. The Slenderman look-alike was lumbering up the hill, and I was headed straight for him at 55 miles per hour, with an 18-wheeler approaching just 3 or 4 car lengths behind. As we entered the turn, I tapped the brakes, veering slightly into the left lane. Before my mind had time to process what was in the road or how I was going to avoid a total rollover, my wife screamed out, "Elk!" We rounded the first half of the S-turn and slowed to a more leisurely 35 miles per hour. As we exited the second half of the turn, I looked back to see that the truck was no longer behind us, having either pulled off to the way station or clobbered the elk. Another deep breath, and I pulled off the road, unsure whether to faint or vomit. I chose a third option, turning uphill, flipping off Slenderman, and giving the car a pat on the bumper for having survived the encounter. We'd soon learn that we were visiting Bear Lake during the rut. The tall, mysterious goth man was a bull elk, heading for us straight on. His height was impressive with or without the antlers. His stature became more apparent as we surfed around him and got a three-quarter view. I've seen what white-tailed deer can do to a car at 40 or 50 miles per hour. I shudder to think what would happen if we'd been just a couple feet further over. The haunted lure is a story that I began telling in episode 7 of the Cottage Chronicles. If you haven't listened to part 1 of the story yet, pause here and go back to listen to that segment. For the rest of you, I've got an update that you won't want to miss. When we left off, I'd taken the haunted lure on its maiden voyage. It cut trees, logs, and riverbed. Everything but fish. You may recall that my spinner collection was dwindling, and this size 3 Black Fury with the yellow polka dots was one of the last remaining medium-sized spinners that I hadn't bent. At the end of the day, I packed it back up and began hatching a plan on how to break the curse. You might notice that I refer to the lure both as cursed and haunted. I haven't experienced any encounters with it. It's just that it keeps showing up when I thought it was gone. That's the haunted bit. The curse, as I figured it, was the utter inability of this lure to catch anything at all. That and the total destruction of my other lures, leading me to fish this one in the first place. Shortly after releasing my last episode, I hit the river in search of a monster pickerel. I hit the pond, scoured the lily pads, and even searched for the raccoon corpse before heading upstream to the pickerel weed. A few casts with a spoon yielded nothing but clumps of decaying plants, fading memories of the lush pads and stem plants that flanked the pickerel weed just weeks before. If I wanted to catch a pickerel, it was time to pull out all the stops. I needed something I could cast further into the shallows and weave precisely between the remaining lily pad stems. There was no question I needed a spinner, and I had just the one for the job. I tied on the cursed lure and immediately hooked a 16.5-inch pickerel. It wasn't the monster I was after, but I thought it might be the key to lifting this curse. It stood to reason that whoever lost the lure in the first place likely placed a curse on it, shouting a string of 4-letter words before lamenting how they couldn't catch a fish with it. If I could then catch something with it, surely I'd release the curse. A few casts later, the lure snagged. I pulled and I shook, but this time it wasn't coming loose. Could it be the lure found its way to a new river, waiting on the next unsuspecting victim? Snap! Just like that, the lure was gone. I returned to my spoon and paddled upstream a bit, to the spot where I caught my first crappie earlier in the season. The water was several feet lower now, and the log pile had collapsed, the top log floating to a nearby cove. A couple casts later, my spoon snagged and my line snapped. Was the curse still following me? Again I paddled on, this time to a spot where I caught an early season PB as my Ned rig was draped over a low-hanging branch. I tied on a Ned head, hooked on a stickworm, and immediately snapped off on a submerged log. I paddled to the opposite bank, tied on my smallest remaining spinner, and went searching for bluegill. 1 cast, 2 casts, 3 casts. Snap. Another lure gone. I lost count of how many lures I lost that day. If a normal day means losing or damaging 3 to 4 lures, I was double to triple that by the time I stopped counting. I hoped that this was the final condition that would break the curse. If my spirit remained unbroken by the end of the day, the curse would lift. I still haven't caught my monster pickerel, but I'm happy to report that the cursed lure hasn't reappeared in any of my tackle trays since then. If you're fishing a river and you encounter an abandoned size 3 MEPS Black Fury lure with a peeling yellow polka dot sticker and a wonky bucktail, don't say I didn't warn you. I've been out fishing a couple more times since then, and I've continued to lose loads of lures. I know part of it is this time of year when I'm fishing shallow streams, I'm fishing closer to brush and overhanging trees, and I'm taking much longer casts with my spinners. But something about it just feels like that curse is still hanging on. I'm going to find a way to break this curse one way or another. Stay tuned and I'll keep you updated. If you liked this episode, check me out on Instagram and Facebook at New Dawn Tackle Company. Keep an eye on the blog for more target species teardowns, updates on my trout fishing season, and updates on fall bass. If you need to stock up on any fishing gear, check me out at newdawntackleco.shop. And if you like the show, keep an eye out on Spotify and on YouTube. Give me a like, subscribe, leave me a comment, let me know what you'd like to see in a future episode. Till next time, tight lines and happy fishing.